Sometime around 900 AD, a city of tens of thousands of people walked away and did not come back. Caracol, in what is now Belize, had been one of the great urban centers of the Maya world. It covered more than 200 square kilometers. Its central acropolis rose above the jungle canopy. Its population at its height may have exceeded that of any European city of the same era. And then, within a few generations, the people who had built it were gone. The plazas emptied, the reservoirs silted up, the jungle moved in. It moved in so completely and so quietly that when explorers first documented the site in the 19th century, the pyramids had become hills. Trees had grown from the tops of temples. The roots of the forest had worked their way into the stone over the course of 1,000 years, and what had been one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the ancient world looked, from the outside, like a natural feature of the landscape. This one is different. The Bronze Age world burned. The Hittite capital was stripped and set alight. But the great cities of the classic Maya were not destroyed in that way. They were not conquered and burned. They were not erased by fire and invasion. They were simply left, abandoned to the heat and the roots and the silence. And in some ways that is harder to comprehend. A city that burns leaves a wound you can see. A city that empties leaves a question that takes 1,000 years to hear. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what these cities were. By the 8th century AD, the Maya lowlands of the southern Yucatan Peninsula, what is now northern Guatemala, Belize, and the southern states of Mexico, were home to one of the most intellectually and artistically sophisticated civilizations in human history. The Maya had developed an astronomy of extraordinary precision, calculating the movements of Venus to within minutes of modern measurements. They had a fully developed writing system, the only one in the pre-Columbian Americas capable of representing the full range of spoken language. They had built cities with monumental stone architecture, sophisticated water management systems, and dense agricultural networks capable of sustaining millions of people in a landscape that, left alone, is dense tropical forest with poor soil and unreliable rainfall. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, reached perhaps 90,000 people at its peak. Its great temples rise 60 meters above the forest floor. Palenque, to the west, produced sculpture and architectural decoration of a refinement that still stops you cold when you see it. Copán, in what is now Honduras, was home to a dynasty of rulers whose carved monuments record their history, their wars, and their genealogies in a script that scholars have spent generations learning to read. These were not simple chiefdoms. They were cities with bureaucracies, with specialized craftspeople, with long-distance trade connections stretching from central Mexico to the Caribbean coast. The Maya Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 AD, was a world of competitive city-states, dozens of kingdoms, each centered on a royal court and a patron deity, each ruled by a king who claimed descent from divine ancestors and whose power was expressed in stone, in ritual, and in war. The kings fought each other. They formed alliances, traded obsidian and jade and cacao, and built ever more elaborate monuments, each new temple built higher than the last, each new stela carved to proclaim the glory of the current dynasty. And here is the first thing to hold. The very fragility was built into the height. To raise those monuments, to feed those cities, to sustain those populations in a tropical forest environment, the Maya had engineered their landscape to its limits. They had cleared enormous areas of forest for agriculture. They had built sophisticated reservoir systems to capture seasonal rainfall, because the lowlands have no permanent rivers of any size, and the wet season and dry season are sharply divided. They had constructed raised field systems in wetland areas to maximize cultivation. The entire urban system rested on this engineered relationship between the population and a landscape that required constant, intensive management to remain productive. What that means is that the civilization was always beneath its brilliance in a negotiation with the rain. So what happened? Between roughly 750 and 900 AD, one after another, the great cities of the southern lowlands went dark. Tikal's last recorded monument dates to 869 AD. Palenque, which had produced some of the most sophisticated art and architecture of the entire classic period, went silent in the early 9th century. Across dozens of sites the pattern repeats. The carving of dated monuments simply stops. Copán, in the hills of western Honduras, had kept the most meticulous royal archive in the Maya world. For more than 4 centuries its kings raised carved stelae in the great plaza, each one dated in the long count calendar, each one recording a coronation, a victory, a lineage stretching back to dynastic founders. Generation after generation, the record continued. Wars against rival cities, alliances sealed in stone, the dates marched forward as if the writing itself were proof that the world would go on. The last of those dates is 822 AD. After that, nothing. No final inscription explaining what went wrong. No last king's epitaph, no closing sentence to the story Copán's scribes had been telling since the early 5th century. The monuments simply stop, mid-thought, as though someone had turned away from the stone and never come back. The dynastic thread the inscriptions had tracked for centuries ends not with catastrophe written in hieroglyphs, but with silence. Scholars can still read the last stelae. They can tell you who carved them and what calendar day they commemorate. What they cannot tell you is why no one carved another. The royal courts cease to function, the population disperses, and the jungle, which the Maya had worked so hard to hold back, returns. For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanation was drought. Simple, singular, final. The rains failed, the crops failed, the civilization failed. It is not wrong, but it is not enough. The paleoclimatological evidence for drought is real and it is compelling. Studies of lake sediment cores from across the Yucatan Peninsula, analysis of stalagmites in regional caves that preserve detailed records of ancient rainfall. Multiple independent lines of evidence now converge on the same conclusion. The late 8th and 9th centuries brought a series of severe, prolonged droughts to the Maya lowlands. Some researchers identify at least 3 distinct multi-year drought episodes within this period, the worst potentially lasting for years without adequate rainfall. In a civilization that stored its water in reservoirs and grew its food in engineered agricultural systems in a landscape with no large rivers to fall back on, this was not merely a hardship, it was a structural crisis. When the reservoirs ran low, the cities that depended on them faced a choice that was not really a choice. Populations that could not be fed could not remain where they were. But stop there, because if drought alone was the answer, you would expect a relatively uniform collapse, cities failing more or less together as the rains failed. What the archaeological record shows is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The collapse did not happen all at once. It happened in waves over more than a century, with some cities failing earlier than others, some surviving longer, some in the same region declining while neighbors persisted. That pattern points to something beyond climate. It points to the political structure of the Maya world itself, and to how that structure responded to stress. Unlike the Bronze Age world, unlike the Hittite Empire, the classic Maya were never a unified state. There was no Hattusa, no central power to which all others answered. The lowlands were a mosaic of independent kingdoms, sometimes allied, frequently at war, and always in competition. That competition had been, during the height of the classic period, one of the engines of Maya achievement. The drive of rival courts to outbuild, outperform, and outlast each other had produced the temples and the sculpture and the astronomical knowledge that still astonishes us. But that same structure, under stress, became a source of catastrophic fragility. When drought began to erode agricultural surpluses, the political consequences were immediate and severe. Maya kings derived their authority not from abstract right, but from demonstrated ability. A king who could not bring rain, who could not feed his people, who could not protect the reservoirs, who could not maintain the ritual calendar that ordered the relationship between the human and divine worlds, was a king whose legitimacy was failing in real time. And failing legitimacy in a world of competing kingdoms is an invitation. The archaeological record shows a sharp increase in warfare in the century before the collapse. More fortifications, more destruction of rival monuments, more evidence of conflict between cities that had previously coexisted within a stable, if tense, regional order. Kingdoms that were already under stress from drought were simultaneously spending resources on war. Populations that needed to be fed were instead being mobilized as armies. Agricultural land that needed careful management was being fought over and disrupted. This is where the Maya collapse converges with the pattern we have traced before, even across an ocean and a millennium. Because what you are watching in the southern lowland Maya world of the 8th and 9th centuries is a cascade. Drought reduces surplus. Reduced surplus weakens kings. Weakened kings face challenges to their authority. Challenged kings go to war. War disrupts agriculture and water management further. Disrupted agriculture deepens the food crisis. A deepened food crisis accelerates the loss of population and political coherence, and the whole system, which had required coordination and stability to function, begins to fail not in one place but everywhere at once, each failure making the next more likely. The Maya did not face a simple external shock. They faced the collapse of the system that had made their civilization possible, triggered by climate stress and amplified by their own political fragmentation, until it reached a point where recovery was beyond what any individual kingdom could manage alone. The Bronze Age collapse was a story of interconnection, kingdoms bound so tightly together that a cascade of failures could run down the entire network like fire along a fuse. The lesson there was about the fragility of complex interdependence. The Maya collapse is a different lesson. These kingdoms were not a single integrated network in the way the Bronze Age powers were. They did not depend on each other for tin or copper in the way that made the Bronze Age economy a single organism. They collapsed not because they were too connected, but because they were too fragmented, too competitive, too unable to coordinate a collective response to a shared threat. Two different structures, Two different mechanisms, one recognizable shape. The pressures accumulate beneath the surface. The system loses the capacity to absorb shocks. The cascade begins. The world that seemed permanent is gone within a lifetime. There is one more thing the Maya record shows us that is worth sitting with. The people did not disappear. This is not a story of extinction. The Maya, as a people, survived. Millions of Maya people are alive today. What collapsed was the political and urban system of the southern lowlands during the Classic period. The population dispersed. Some moved north to the cities of the northern Yucatan, which continued for centuries and included the famous late site of Chichen Itza. Some moved to highland areas. The cities of the southern lowlands were left, but the people scattered and endured. What was lost was the specific civilization of the Classic period, the royal courts, the stela carving tradition, the elaborate political hierarchies, the monument building that had expressed a particular way of organizing human life and meaning in the landscape. The cities themselves were lost in the most physical sense, swallowed by the forest until the 19th and 20th centuries, when explorers and archaeologists began to find them again, one by one, beneath the canopy. There is something in that image that belongs specifically to this collapse, and to no other. Tikal's temples emerging above the forest this morning look almost exactly as they did when a returning hunter might have glimpsed them 100 years after they were abandoned. The stone is still there. The carvings are still there. The hieroglyphs still say what they said when the last king had them carved. It is everything human around the stone that is gone. The classic Maya, built for permanence. Their inscriptions record long count dates stretching millions of years into the past and future, a calendar system that implied a world without end. Their kings commissioned monuments intended to stand forever. The civilization that created them believed, as they all do, that what they had built was solid enough to outlast any difficulty the world might send. The roots of the forest disagreed. The next descent is the one everyone thinks they know. Rome did not fall in a day. It took 300 years, and it spent most of them insisting it was fine. If you want to follow the pattern wherever it leads, subscribe, and we will continue.